Okay, so let's get into our first main type of tissue, which is going to be epithelial tissue. Now, we've already kind of talked about it, right? It's a type of tissue. So we were looking at its concentration of cells versus extracellular matrix. It has a lot of cells and little ECM. So when we are identifying the different types of epithelial tissue, we are going to be looking only at the cells. Okay. Also, just general characteristic of epithelial tissue, it is typically going to be lining organs. Another really interesting and unique characteristic of epithelial tissue is that it has an apical surface and a basal surface. Okay, so what this means is for epithelial tissue, you're going to see this apical surface, or sometimes even referred to as a free surface, that's essentially facing the body surface or the body cavity, or something we call the lumen. The lumen is called, or just kind of translated to, the free space. Okay, so as I show more examples of epithelial tissue, I'll point out the apical side and the lumen. Okay, then at the bottom of epithelial tissue, you'll see a basal surface, it's really just the opposite. Okay, it's the deepest layer of epithelial cells, and it's going to adhere to something called the basement membrane, which is our next characteristic. Okay, so let's look over at our image here so we can see the apical free surface pointing towards the body cavity, the body surface, the lumen, whatever this may be. Then we have the basal surface, the deepest layer of the epithelial tissue. Okay, and then it attaches to something called the basement membrane. Now, there are two portions of the basement membrane. I'm not interested in lecture for you being able to kind of talk to me about them. I just am interested in you guys understanding the general sense of what the basement membrane is. And it's essentially just used to attach the tissue or anchor the tissue, the epithelial tissue, to underlining connective tissue. Okay, this is really, it's just an anchor. Okay, it's just like the basement of a house, it anchors it to the ground. Okay, so basement membrane is going to be connected to the basal surface of epithelial tissue superiorly, and then we are also going to see inferiorly, we'll see connective tissue um, underlying the basement membrane. Connective tissue is always going to be found deep to epithelial tissue. The reason is epithelial tissue is avascular. Okay, so let's think about what avascular means. Anytime you see the word A or the letter A in front of a word, it typically is meaning without. So, without vasculature, epithelial tissue does not have its own blood supply. Epithelial tissue relies on the blood supply of connective tissue. Okay, so it's kind of interesting. Epithelial tissue has its own nerve endings and whatnot, but it does not have its own vasculature. So it's always going to, have connective tissue underlying it, so that connective tissue can bring nutrients via the blood vessels and then also remove waste from the epithelial tissue, again, via blood vessels. All right, so those are our general characteristics of epithelial tissue. Honestly, keeping those things in mind really helps you identify epithelial tissue, okay? If you know that it's always going to be towards the surface, if you know that you're looking for something without blood supply, maybe, it's obvious that there's a blood vessel or something on the prep. If you know that you're looking for a lot of cells and no ECM, right? It's going to be easier to narrow down the tissue types. So let's talk about the subcategories of epithelial tissue and how we name them. So there's a few different ways that we classify epithelial tissue. The first way is looking at the layers of cells. Okay, so looking at layers, we can either have many layers, or just one layer. Okay, so looking at the layers, if we have multiple layers, we call it stratified. Multiple layers, stratified. And literally, even if it's two, okay, it's still more than one, so we call it stratified. Now, over here, this is weird. This is our little oddball, our little exception. This is called pseudo-stratified. Pseudo-stratified. If we remember what pseudo means, that means false or fake, okay? So it's fake or falsely stratified. When we're looking at this tissue, we're looking and seeing that the nuclei are kind of, they're lying and stacked at different levels, right? We could follow this across and it wouldn't be at the same level, right? We could follow this across and it wouldn't be at the same level as the other ones, right? So they're at different levels. So because of the position of the nuclei and the fact that some of these cells don't come all the way up to the apical surface, it gives the appearance of this stratified look of having multiple layers. However, we can look and see, okay, this purple line down here, that's representing the basement membrane. And every single one of these cells is connecting to the basement membrane. That means that it's not actually stratified. So we call it pseudo-stratified. Whereas over here, this cell, it has no connection to the basement membrane. This cell over here has no connection to the basement membrane. So we can see that these are truly stratified. These are truly having multiple layers. But what if there is only one layer of cells? If it's multiple, we call it stratified. If it looks like multiple but not really, we call it pseudo-stratified. What do we call it when it's just one layer of cells? We call it simple. Okay, simple epithelial tissue. That's what we have down here. So all of these examples are just one single layer of cells. They're all having this connection to the basement membrane, showing that it's all one layer. So these are all examples of simple. Okay, so that's all going into the layers classification: stratified, simple, or pseudo-stratified. We can also classify epithelial tissue by looking at the cell shape or sometimes just cell type is how we refer to it. Okay, so the first cell shape that we can see is called squamous. Squamous cells, I think they look like you were to crack an egg in a frying pan and like it looks like the yolk and like all of the egg whites and whatnot just like kind of displaced onto the pan. That's what I picture when I look at a squamous cell, especially in a 2D image. Okay, so it's kind of just like this squished, squamous, squished. Okay, cuboidal, they look like cubes. And the nucleus is really large and it fills up most of the space in that cell. Columnar, these guys they're large, okay? They are going to be taller than they are wide. They literally look like columns, okay? The cool thing about columnar tissue is that it's going to typically have some type of structure on the apical surface, either called cilia or microvilli, and we'll talk about the difference in a moment. Okay, so those are our classifications. We look at first, okay, how many layers is it? One layer? Multiple layers? Looking sort of like multiple, but actually is only masquerading as multiple and is really just single, right? And then we also look then at the cell shape / type. Now I have in the corner transitional tissue. Transitional tissue is a type of epithelial tissue that is weird. It's just there's always these exceptions, and transitional epithelial tissue is one of them. Transitional epithelial tissue does not have one of the three like typical epithelial cell classifications. Transitional epithelial tissue has transitional cells. We'll talk about it more in a minute, but just keep it in the back of your head that transitional tissue is weird. Okay. All right, so let's go over again the functions of epithelial tissue, right? So we are protecting. Epithelial tissue lines organs, okay? It lines the skin, it's part of the skin, so it's helping protect us, okay? So it protects all of our internal organs. Really cool thing is that our sweat can actually alter the pH of our skin and actually is creating like a more acidic environment to some bacteria. And so it can actually kill off bacteria just by sweating. So that's cool. So again, epithelial tissue, protection. Also sensation, right? So if we're talking again about in the skin, epithelial tissue in the skin, we have these like sensory receptors, right, that are going to pick up signals, transmissions from the receptors and send them off, right? So we have these different sensations that we can we'll go over those specific structures when we get to the integumentary system, the skin system, but we do see that, kind of like a secondary function for epithelial tissue. We also see secretion. So we will talk about this later, but epithelial tissue does have glandular secretions. So there's these different chemical substances that are going to be actually secreted from this type of tissue. It could be enzymes, could be hormones, could be some type of fluid. And then we also have absorption. So because some epithelial cells line the intestines, those cells are going to help absorb those nutrients from the digested food. All right. So this looks complicated, but I promise it's straightforward. Okay. So here is a list of the different types of epithelial tissue that you guys need to know. Okay. Now you can either call it epithelial tissue or epithelium. I will not take off for that. Okay. So let's first look. We have simple. So that means one layer. Squamous. So that means we're looking at a one layer of squamous cells, epithelial tissue. Okay. So that is what we're viewing in that little cartoon. Simple squamous epithelium is going to be typically found in blood vessels and the air sacs of the lungs and can also be seen in the heart and lymphatic vessels. Because it's only one layer of cells, it's going to allow materials to pass through via diffusion. So it also is going to, we'll see like a lot of secretions as well. Okay. The next one, simple one layer cuboidal cells, right? So these are going to be seen in glands and the kidney tubules. Kidney tubules is typically the location I look for when I'm asking for where simple cuboidal epithelial tissue is located. Okay, and again, because it's simple, it's one layer, it's going to be secreting and absorbing. Now, we have simple columnar epithelium. Okay, simple columnar. Now, this simple columnar epithelium can either be ciliated or non-ciliated. So we would call it, if it was ciliated, we would say ciliated simple columnar or non-ciliated simple columnar. Okay, so we can see still one layer, and we can see that actually looks like microvilli on top, but it also could be cilia, right? We'll talk about that in a minute, but with this type of tissue, we're going to be actually seeing them kind of along the digestive tract, maybe along bladder, could be in the bronchi, uterine tubes, which are also called fallopian tubes, you may have heard of. Okay. They're going to be absorbing, but also secreting. And that's where the cilia kind of play in. Okay. Then we have that weird one, pseudostratified. Okay. Pseudostratified. So it looks like it's multiple layers, but we know that it's not because every single cell is touching the basement membrane. Okay. So pseudostratified. Anytime we have pseudostratified, you can just automatically put, columnar. Okay. We only see pseudostratified with the columnar cell shape. All right. And so these are going to be either ciliated or non-ciliated as well. The ciliated tissue we'll see lining the trachea and a lot of the upper respiratory tract. Because it has cilia or could have cilia, it's going to be moving mucus. It also will secrete the mucus. Okay. Those are our epithelial tissues that all are one layer, right? Either we're calling it simple or pseudostratified, it's still one layer. Over on this side, we have our stratifieds. Okay, so with the stratified, remember it's any time that it's more than one, right? So even if it's two, it's still considered stratified. 2 layers. Okay, so the first type we have is stratified squamous epithelial tissue. Now, actually, stratified squamous can be broken down into categories called keratinized or non-keratinized. We'll talk about that in a moment. So there's actually 2 different types of stratified squamous epithelial, but depending on the type that you're looking at, you'll see this type of tissue lining the esophagus, the mouth, the vagina, or the very top of the skin. Okay, so it's also going to be functioning as protecting against abrasion. Now, with stratified cuboidal and stratified columnar, I'm not interested in you guys knowing the locations. Okay, we do need to be able to identify it, and we should be able to kind of have an idea of how it functions, but we do not need to know the location. Okay, that's fine. Okay, so stratified cuboidal. Cuboidal cells, multiple layers. They're going to be a protective tissue. Stratified columnar cells, multiple layers, columnar cells, right? Epithelial tissue, fantastic. They're going to be secreting and protecting. And then we have the weird one, transitional epithelial tissue. So remember, transitional epithelial tissue has transitional cells. And the cool thing about the transitional cells is that they can be either squamous shaped or cuboidal shaped. So they'll either look like a cube or they'll look like a squished cube. Okay. The reason is because transitional cells and transitional epithelial tissue are found in organs that typically are expanding and stretching and then collapsing to a smaller size. Okay, so when the organ is resting, it would appear to have cuboidal cells on the apical surface, and when the organ is stretching, it will have, and expanding, it will have more of a squamous shaped cell on the apical surface because it's getting stretched. Okay, so these are going to be found in typically the bladder, the urethra, or the ureters, in the basically the urinary system.